The Spotlight, shining a light on podcasts and videos that have caught our attention.
Hi and welcome to The Spotlight. My name is Jen Spiker and today I'm highlighting part of a recent conversation that Neil Johnson had with former Prime Minister Scott Morrison on 2020. Mr. Morrison has recently resigned from politics and is about to release a memoir. What's different about this memoir is that it focuses on how Christian faith influenced Scott's life, decisions, time in Parliament, and the turbulent years that he served as Prime Minister. The memoir is due for release in May and is titled Plans for Your Good, a Prime Minister's testimony of God's faithfulness.
The Spotlight with Jen Spiker.
There have been many Christian Prime Ministers in Australia, but it's become a point of fascination, especially to the mainstream media, that Scott Morrison was Australia's first evangelical Pentecostal Prime Minister. In his valedictory speech to the Parliament just a month ago, Scott Morrison used the opportunity to call the nation back to God. Well, it is our privilege today to welcome former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Mr. Morrison, a special welcome along to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. It's good to be with you.
If you don't mind, I'll call you Scott. Scott,
Sure.
For listeners, the title of your book, Plans for Your Good. From the scripture in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, for a lot of people, this is one of their favourite scriptures. Is this one of yours too?
Yeah, it is. I have many, but when I wrote the book, it was originally had a working title of many names. One was How Good is God, which is something that I think Australians understand, but American audiences don't really understand and how we use that phrase. I refer to it in the book, but no, what came back as I'd finished the work and we were talking about a title, I kept coming back to this verse, and I kept coming back to the fundamental question is whether we believe this or not. If we believe that verse, well, our life is very different. And if we don't believe that verse, then it's also very different. So I think it's one of those verses in the Bible which really sort of put the clear question of faith before us. And, of course, faith is what we believe, and what we believe is not how we feel. It's what we choose and what we do. And so, I've always found that verse very encouraging, but at the same time very directing, that, we can be confident that when we're on his plan, that plan takes us towards him, which is where we want to go.
Well, the rest of that verse says from Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. So this memoir, Scott Morrison, not a typical memoir for a Prime Minister, but a focus around faith. Give us some insight here into what drives you to talk about faith and not perhaps putting the boot into your old political foes.
Yeah, well, I never had really any plans to do a memoir at all. The memoir is, a regurgitation of one's political activities, which I think would be quite tedious. I'm not a big reader of political autobiographies because, frankly, as politicians, it's very hard for us to sort of step back. And, biographies is a different story. And if anyone ever goes down that path, well, that will be for them and history. But this was not a story about what I've done, but this my story about what God has done for me. That's the difference. It's a testimony of his faithfulness, not mine. And that's something I'm very sure of, what he's done. And so it's really to bear witness to that and to encourage others, regardless of what role you're in, whether you're a Prime Minister or you're a teacher or you're a police officer or you're running a small business or you're looking after elderly parents or kids or whatever vocation or role in life you find yourself in. He's got a plan, and what we seek to do is get on that plan.
Scott, I don't know whether you get as many opportunities to share your own personal story of faith, coming to faith in Christ, but perhaps the shortened version, how do you describe those early inklings that there must be something more than just what I can see? Those thoughts about who was instrumental in sharing their own faith with you. Give us an insight into your personal faith journey.
Well, it really started in my family. I grew up in a Christian family. My parents both very active in their local church, which was a Presbyterian church initially, and then it turned into a Uniting Church. And I was involved in Boys Brigade all those years ago. It's still around today. And we were at a camp down in Melbourne, and, I'd heard the gospel many times. I discussed it many times with my parents, and my older brother, who was a Christian, he came along to the Billy Graham crusade. My father used to take me every single night to that Billy Graham crusade over there in Randwick, which wasn't too far from where we lived. And I remember one night I wanted to go down the front with my brother, and my father stopped me because he knew I was just following my brother. I wasn't following God, I was following my brother. And come. And it did down in Melbourne at the end of that camp, and there was a call put out. I talk about this in the book. I couldn't recall what the pastor said, the minister said on that day. All I know is one thing I know: I'm sitting on the seat. The next thing you know, I'm standing up and giving my life, and it was a life-changing moment. And there have been many since then, because while our point of salvation is a key point in our faith journey, it's not the only key transitioning point, I think. There are many transformational points we go through in our faith journey as God reveals himself to us, and we enter into deeper and deeper relationship with him, which is what the whole Christian journey is about. It's about our relationship with him and deepening it each and every day.
People were very excited that there would be a Pentecostal Prime Minister leading Australia. But then there would be some who would say, I'm disappointed when you became more political than Pentecostal. And some might have thought, we're expecting more from a Christian Pentecostal Prime Minister to dig in deep. How do you reflect on even the critics, but even the journey as it has unfolded?
Well, I never saw myself as a Pentecostal Prime Minister. I don't really see myself as a Pentecostal Christian as such. I go to an evangelical Pentecostal church. I've been to Baptist churches. I've been to Uniting churches. I love going to Maronite churches. I talk about in the book, if your church is preaching Christ and a relationship with him and loving others and salvation through faith alone, well, we're going to the same church. I was elected as a Liberal. I was elected by the people of Australia, not because of my faith. That just happens to be who I am, and I've always thought to be transparent about that. I think we have to be very careful about the blend of politics and faith. I was a Christian in politics. I wasn't a political Christian. There's a difference between those two things. And I sought to live out my faith in my vocation, as you do in yours, as people do in lots of walks of life. And I think it's very dangerous to create expectations around some sort of political agenda as Christians.
Let's talk faith and politics. You say that Australians have put far too much faith in imperfect politicians, imperfect institutions. And now they're disillusioned, perhaps, because all faith in the secularised government doesn't necessarily bring the outcomes that people hope will come. Any thoughts here?
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that our whole society was based on Judeo-Christian values about the dignity of the individual human being and the made in God's image by his hand for his glory. I talk about that. And when we lose touch with our identity as individual human beings with true worth and value and loved, then what are we basing everything else on? I mean, what are human rights based on if it's not on that? And when we disconnect from that, what do we replace it with? I mean, the hunger and thirst for something to be sort of directing and controlling doesn't go away. And so what I've observed at my time in politics, and it particularly accelerated, I think, over the last 5 years and over the entire more than 16 years I was in Parliament, people look to government as some sort of salvation for everything, an answer to every solution. And it's not. It's part of a solution to the many challenges that we face in our society. It has a role to play, and it's important that Christians are part of that, as Daniel was part of Nebuchadnezzar's government, as Joseph was part of Pharaoh's government. I mean, there have always been Christians and people of faith. working in civil administration. But what I fear and am concerned about is when you take God out of the culture, what do you replace him with? And my point is, we've cut ourselves off as a society in the West, not just Australia, it's all around Western society. We sort of feel like the society feels like it's grown up from God, as if it's sort of come out of Sunday school. And we don't need that anchor anymore. Well, what I think we're doing as a society is now we're just completely untethered and we're adrift. And where are we drifting? That's the question. And I don't think government isn't going to solve that because it's fundamentally about values and principles. And when we step away from those, then our society can be in a bit of strife. What is the basis for the decisions we make, the choices and the goals that we pursue? That is the trouble I have with where things are at now.
Australians are secularising very quickly, and the outcome of that secular state may well be summed up in the thought of the outcome will be pessimistic, a pessimism that goes hand in hand with the secular state. And that contrasts, doesn't it, with the optimism that comes from the verse that you chose from Jeremiah.
Sure.
About God being for good and not for harm, a future that is filled with hope. So without God, are we stuck in pessimism? Do we have to rediscover that there's something that's going to bring the hope and the optimism that we need as a nation for the future?
Well, I hope Christians wouldn't need to rediscover that. I would hope that Christians were full of hope and full of optimism. And it does trouble me a bit when I see some Christians get terribly pessimistic about this and get very worked up. I was speaking at my own church last Sunday and I said, I don't think God called us to shout at people in capital letters on Facebook. I don't think that's part of the plan. And we've got to be very careful about how we engage in these things. I actually think Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego are really good examples of what we should do as living as Christians in what is an increasingly secularised society. I said in my maiden speech to Parliament, secularism is not the national religion. There is no national religion, and secularism has no greater claim to the nation's faith base than any other faith. It's important in a free society that we get to choose what we believe, and I believe God would have it no other way. So I think we have a message of hope. I think we have a message of peace. I think we have a message of empowerment for all people. I think we have a message of diversity and inclusion, one that reaches out to everybody. Everyone is welcome. When you look at the church today, in the West, the church is criticised for being white and 50. Well, that's just not the case. The church is Chinese. The church is Iranian. The church is African. The church is male. It's female. It's old. It's young. That is the nature of the church. It is the most inclusive, most diverse community of faith anywhere in the world.
On the Spotlight, we've been listening to part of a recent conversation between Neil Johnson and former Prime Minister Scott Morrison on 2020. There's lots more of this conversation, including listener questions for Mr. Morrison. You can watch it all by tapping the Watch tab of the Vision app and scroll to the 2020 channel. If you have a favourite podcast or video series that you'd like to hear featured on the Spotlight, click Contact Us at vision.org.au and share the link. My name's Jen Spiker. Join me next time as I share another podcast or video that deserves highlighting.
For more great podcasts and videos like the one featured today, check out vision.org.au or the free Vision app.